Now let's talk about Oregon. The Oregon country, as it was called at that time, is pictured here. You've got what ultimately became the U.S. part and the British part, but initially, for decades, it was all one big thing. Oregon extended well up into western Canada. The Treaty of Ghent in 1818, which officially ended the War of 18. The war was officially ended. This is when they sort of kind of parsed out the consequences of the War of 1812. Remember that Thomas Jefferson had sent Lewis and Clark all the way to the Pacific coast specifically so that they would be able to make a claim of presence in Oregon. And so the U.S. claimed it and Britain claimed it. The decision that was made at the Treaty of Ghent was it was to be jointly administered by both countries. Now, the British did not intend for the area to be settled. That wasn't their primary purpose for it, to have a place for English people to move to, but rather to be able to operate there, especially Hudson's Bay Company, which had started well to the east and moved its influence westward, and the Northwest Company, both fur companies that were going to be setting up forts and trading posts along the area. There weren't really hardly any Americans in the area in 1818, except for a handful of mountain men who were operating in the eastern part of the area. In 1843, having heard stories of how beautiful the Oregon country is and how open it is, and that is open to settlement, not many people living there, and that the United States had at least a partial claim on it, a group of settlers decided to head west from the Mississippi River, and they were operating on the reports and under the guidance of various mountain men who knew the trails. So they followed one of the mountain men trails and broadened it. Now that mountain man trail, it was an Indian trail. They broadened it, clearing out a space big enough to get a wagon down. And so they headed west to Oregon in the early 1840s, and then the following year, more people did the same thing, more wagon trains. It was easier now because that road had been established that was able to accommodate these Conestoga wagons made in Conestoga, Pennsylvania. 1843, the Great Migration, huge numbers of people now headed west across the Oregon Trail. There were various offshoots from the main trail, California Trail, the Bozeman Trail up into Montana, and the Mormon Trail later on. It was shortly after this, just a couple of years after this, that the big exodus of Mormons under Brigham Young happened, and they followed part of the Oregon Trail and then sort of branched out on their own. Between 1843 and 1855, a time period of about 12 years, between 300,000 and 400,000 settlers traveled across this trail. And you can see they started in Independence, Missouri. They go past Fort Laramie, U.S. Army fort. They stop off at Fort Bridger, run by Jim Bridger, the mountain man. And then they head on up into the Oregon country. Now, some of you may be familiar with the Oregon Trail primarily through this really old computer game that has managed to live on. It started in the early 80s, and different versions of it exist. It's very simplistic. Basically, you get on the Oregon Trail and you're probably going to die of dysentery. That's what happens to most people in the game. Or you might get killed by Indians. And there is many an old Western that has as its plot settlers on the Oregon Trail fighting with Native Americans. Now, in reality, in that 20-year period, there were about 362 settlers killed on the northern plains along the Oregon Trail. 362. That's out of 350 to 400,000. So that means that settlers killed by Indians amounted to about, let's see, one 1,000th, 0.001%. Slightly more Indians were killed by settlers, 460, which probably would have also been a bigger percentage because there were fewer of them. In reality, there were a few of these confrontations, but overall, not many considering the number of people who were involved. And in reality, most of the tribes looked at this as a business opportunity because these people traveling through their territory had lots of things to trade. And they needed things in return, like, for example, food. So there was quite a bit of bartering going on. There was also quite a bit of stealing going on from the herds that the settlers were bringing, cattle rustling, pilfering. But there were also some major concerns. Now think about this. You got 400,000 people tromping through your backyard, through your hunting grounds, and they're killing the animals, or you're killing the animals to trade with them for cool stuff they have. That's a lot of people to feed. That's a lot of animals. So animals became scarce. The ones that weren't killed ran away to go somewhere else where there weren't, 400,000 people. Also scarce firewood, which was scarce to begin with. But it was what little was there. The few copses of trees in the area were quickly consumed. And beyond the overhunting, there's just also the fact that there was overgrazing by all these cattle that were passing through, eating up all this grass in this area that was roamed by buffalo, on whom the Native Americans lived. So then the buffalo are short on grass. So this is some major problems that's going to lead to a major treaty, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. And in that treaty, the United States government gets together with the leadership of 8 different Northern Plains tribes. And you can see the various tribes here and their territory. And in this very consequential treaty held at Fort Laramie, the Indians guaranteed safe passage to all the settlers passing through in exchange for annuities. What is an annuity? An annual payment. The payment, in some cases, was made in money, but not usually, because what use was money to a nomadic tribe on the Great Plains? It was usually food and trade goods that they were to receive a certain amount each year. And in return, they would allow safe passage, they would allow roads to be built, and even forts to be built along the way, just in case, to protect the settlers. And what did the Indians get? They got a guarantee that this area, the darker area here, treaty land, this area was guaranteed to these 8 tribes forever. Now, this is going to be a factor in the 21st century in the protests at Standing Rock. But although it's a very interesting story, it's a very different story. Well, whether we're talking about the Anglos going to Texas, or settlers going to Oregon, or later on, with the gold rush heading to California, there's a lot of people from the settled area of the United States heading westward, and in the 1840s. And it was around this time that a term was coined that you're probably familiar with, manifest destiny. So this map shows the different areas and when they were gained, but we haven't got to that part yet. So it was coined by a journalist, John L. O'Sullivan, in an editorial where he talked about America's manifest destiny being to occupy the entire interior of the country from one ocean to the other. Everything in between, within the north and south boundaries of Canada and Mexico, should belong to the United States of America. Should, but at that time did not. Oregon country was contested, and most of the Southwest was part of Mexico. Now, what does it mean, manifest destiny? You probably all heard that expression. Manifest means obvious or visible. So, if you ever watch any of those supernatural ghost hunting shows, they're looking for a manifestation of a ghost. That is, a ghost that has become visible. If you haven't watched those shows, good for you. So, in other words, this is the obvious destiny of America, is to fill in all these empty spaces. Now, this ties in to the idea of American exceptionalism, that the American people, the idea of the American people are particularly virtuous, more virtuous than anybody else, better than anybody else, and ordained by God to settle in what is now the United States. A city on a hill. So this was first introduced by the Puritan governor John Winthrop in 1630, that their colony would be like a city on a hill. Actually, it was first introduced by Jesus in the Gospels, where he was saying, talking about manifestation of faith. A city on a hill is visible from a long ways off. So Winthrop used that imagery. Thomas Paine in 1776 in Common Sense talked about this new country, the United States, was meant to be a city on a hill, a beacon for freedom and liberty. But now in the approaching mid-19th century, something was added to that there was a mission to spread the democratic institutions of the United States, to spread them across the continent, and that it was America's destiny set forth by God to do so. Now, to the Whigs, this sounded like treason because it sounded un-American. We're talking about spreading these democratic institutions by force, by taking lands away from other people. It sounded a whole lot like right of conquest, rather than the concept of republicanism on which the country had been founded. So there were a lot of Whigs opposed to the idea of manifest destiny, a lot of Democrats very much in favor of it. And all this is summarized really well in this painting. The painting is called American Progress, and it was painted by John Gast in 1872. So this whole manifest destiny thing's really starting to get some power in the 1840s. I said that it increased really after the Civil War. So that ended in 1865. This painting, by the way, was displayed. Prints of this were displayed in bars and saloons all over the country during this time period. So the sort of thing you sit and drink your beer and look up at. So American Progress. American Progress is represented in this painting by this beautiful, fair-skinned and fair-haired lady beautiful blonde lady in flowing robes who is moving from right to left, from east to west. She is progress. American progress, American superiority, really, of American civilization. And you'll notice that behind her, it's all sunny because that's where she's already been. And you'll notice that behind her you see trains, and you see in the lower right-hand corner farmers that are conquering of the land, and then right there at her feet, stagecoaches heading west, and groups of pioneers heading west. But you'll also notice that in the west, you can see up in the upper left, you can see the Rocky Mountains up there. That in the west, everything is dark. It's dark, it's benighted, it's in shadow, it's mysterious. It has not yet been reached by the enlightenment of American civilization and progress. So, in that dark area, there are wild animals like buffalo, and you see some wolves there. You see some Indians that would count as wild animals to people looking at this picture at that time. And so as the fair-haired, golden-haired maiden of the West, or of America, travels westward, then the light is going to shine in those shadowy corners, and they too will become brightly lit and promising, and evidence of progress, and all the things standing in the way of progress, like wildlife or Native Americans, will be swept away. So, like I said, that perfectly encapsulates what the concept of manifest destiny is all about. Now, by the way, some of you may be familiar with this, probably most of you aren't. There was a TV series called Hell on Wheels. I think it was on for 6 or 7 years. Started in 2011 as a Western on AMC about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. The reason I mention it now is because the first couple of seasons, they really played up and demonstrated this idea of the fair-haired maiden of the West. That's something that was, in fact, a plot point of the series, and it's a really good show. And of course, it's dramatized and it's fiction, but it is pretty good representation of the building of the railroad. Well, let's get back to the Republic of Texas. Remember when the revolution occurred in Texas, the idea was not to remain an independent country, but to eventually be annexed by the United States, become part of the U.S. In 1844, President John Tyler reintroduced that idea. This was 4 years into his term, the last year of his term. Remember, his term started kind of suddenly because he was vice president for about a month until William Henry Harrison died. Anyway, he reintroduced the idea. John C. Calhoun wrote a letter. He was Secretary of State at this time. He wrote a letter, and the letter was kind of circulated. The ideas were circulated among some senators, in which he made the argument that annexing Texas was a good thing to do because it could strengthen the South's peculiar institution, that is to say, slavery. Because automatically, if it gets brought in, now it's below that line from the Compromise of 1820, automatically you get 2 new senators from a slave state, plus however many congressmen, and of course there were no congresswomen at this time because women couldn't vote, let alone run for office, but two senators plus however many congressmen. But he proposed the idea that because Texas was so big, it didn't have to be brought in as one state. It could be broken down to 5 states. So there could be like Central Texas, North Texas, South Texas, East Texas, and West Texas. And each one of those would have 2 senators. That's 10 new pro-slavery senators that really would seal the deal for the ability for Southerners in the Senate to protect slavery. Well, that letter was leaked to the press, as was some of the proposals that were going around in Senate. Now, I'm not sure if this guy, Benjamin Tappan, leaked the letter, but he did get censured by the Senate for leaking the details of the proposal to the press. Of course, this is Senator Benjamin Tappan of Massachusetts, the brother of the other Tappan brothers, Lewis and Arthur, who were very famous abolitionists. And by the way, his first name is Benjamin. That's for his great uncle, Benjamin Franklin. So Benjamin Franklin, great uncle to the Tappan brothers. Anyway, when the news got out of this proposal of Calhoun, people in the North were furious because this was going to seriously disrupt the balance of power if it happened this way. Now, in order to kind of calm down people in the North, the 2 guys who were kind of vying with one another for the nomination for their party, Martin Van Buren, who, remember, had been voted out of office in 1840, but was now trying to run again and get the Democratic nomination, and Henry Clay, who finally got another shot and was, it looked like, about to get the Whig nomination. Both of them released letters to the public saying that they promised, if they became president, they would not annex Texas because annexing Texas might lead to a war with Mexico, who still claimed Texas. But in reality, promising that they're not going to annex Texas is also going to kind of assuage the fears of their northern voters, northern Democrats and northern Whigs. However, kind of backfired on Martin Van Buren because he kind of made the northern Democrats feel better, but he really ticked off the southern Democrats, and there were more of them. And so he didn't get the nomination at all, even though it looked like he almost had it locked in. So kind of at the last minute, somebody else got the nomination, somebody unexpected. James K. Polk of Tennessee, relatively unknown. Polk was the first dark horse candidate. That means somebody that gets a position, gets nominated or elected to something that was totally off everyone's radar, came seemingly from out of nowhere, like a horse coming up from behind in a horse race. Polk was, well, I say relatively unknown. He's pretty well known in Tennessee, where he had been governor. He was like Andrew Jackson and many previous presidents, a slaveholder. In fact, Andrew Jackson had tried to convince Martin Van Buren to tap Polk as his vice presidential running mate back in 1840 when Van Buren was running for re-election. Van Buren's vice president at that time, Richard Mentor Jones, was involved in some scandals, but Van Buren didn't let the guy go, and instead, anyway, didn't go with Polk. But now Polk gets the nomination, and he makes some promises. He promises to re-annex Texas, which is a bizarre thing because it had never been annexed to start with. But by putting it that way, that's obviously inaccurate, but it conveys the idea that we're taking Texas back, that it rightfully belongs to us. Also, that the U.S. was going to reoccupy Oregon. Remember that map we looked at earlier that showed the Oregon country stretched way up into Canada? He promised that he was going to resolve the dispute with Great Britain and decide once and for all who was in charge, and his supporters wanted the whole thing. all the way up to the 5440 parallel, which is the northern border of the Oregon country, way up in Canada. And so their slogan was 5440 or fight. In other words, Britain's going to give us the whole thing, or we're going to war with them. Now, the Whigs' slogan was, "Who's James K. Polk?" But it didn't work because he got elected, as it ultimately turns out. A little bit of a spoiler alert. Now, there was another candidate besides Polk and Henry Clay, and that was this guy, James Birney. We've mentioned him once before. By the way, Tyler was the sitting president, John Tyler. He was a Whig, and he was so unpopular within his own party that his own party didn't nominate him to be the candidate. They didn't nominate him for re-election. So he's ticked off at the Whigs. He could have still run, but he actually sided with Polk and the Democrats because he wanted to stick it to the Whigs. So he dropped out of the race and threw his support to Polk. And then this guy, James Birney, we talked about him once before. He was an abolitionist who had a newspaper in Cincinnati that had been destroyed by an angry mob. Former congressman from Kentucky. The Liberty Party was the name of this party, and its sole purpose was the abolition of slavery. Now, this is not the first third party, but it is the first party to have the abolition of slavery in their platform at all, let alone as their main thing that they were going for. By the way, Polk was one of those members of the American Anti-Slavery Society who quit and went off and joined another group because they started letting women have leadership positions. So anyway, Birney is not going to be a huge factor here. The election is held. You've got James K. Polk as the Democrat with his running mate George M. Dallas, former governor of Philadelphia, and Henry Clay, senator from Kentucky, has as his running mate Theodore Frelinghuysen, who was a senator from New Jersey and later was the president of Rutgers University. It's a good thing he had a job lined up because the Whigs lost and Polk was elected president. Now, John Tyler got in one last jab at everybody before he left office. So, the election's in November. Back then, the inauguration wasn't until March. So right before he left office, he went ahead and annexed Texas so that James K. Polk and the Democrats couldn't take credit for it. So officially, Texas was annexed and became part of the United States. Now, Polk, pretty interesting in a lot of ways. One such way was the fact that when he ran for office, he said he was not going to run for re-election. He was intentionally setting out to be a one-term president, and he only had a small number of things he promised to do, and he did all of them. It's, certainly, well, I don't think it even is debatable. Many of these things he wanted to do weren't very good things, but he said he'd do them, and he did, which in some ways makes him the most successful president ever because he kept all his campaign promises, notwithstanding the fact he hadn't made many. So he wanted to reduce the tariff that the Whigs had passed in 1842, to reestablish the independent treasury system, which had been set up by Martin Van Buren as an alternative to the national bank that Andrew Jackson had destroyed, but the Whigs had blocked that in 1842, to settle the dispute over Oregon with Great Britain, and they did settle it. Now, his followers wanted the whole thing. He never said he was going to get the whole thing. He just said he was going to settle it, and he did. The settlement was that it was divided in half, and the U.S. got the southern half, and Britain got the northern half. He also said that he would get California, which at that time was part of Mexico, as Texas had previously been. Well, it all kind of comes to a head in Texas. Now, Texas has been annexed and is now part of the United States. But what are the borders of Texas? The Republic of Texas claimed one set of borders. That was the idea that the Rio Grande was their southern border. But Mexico, inasmuch as they even admitted there was such a thing as Texas, said that no, their southern border was the Nueces River. So there, the part in Manila, that's what Mexico claimed Texas was. But then the Manila part plus the green part is what Texas claimed Texas was. Texans always, magnify things, if you didn't know. So this leads to some tension between the U.S. and Mexico as to what's going to be occupied. So the United States sent troops to the border, the southern border, the Nueces, and the Mexican government sent troops also. The U.S. secretly sent envoys to the Mexican government offering to make up the difference by buying that green part, giving them money, but Mexico refused to accept that. And so there was an incident. There was an incident that occurred, and shots were exchanged. The U.S. claimed that Mexicans had fired on American troops. Mexican government denied that. The U.S. claimed that Mexicans had advanced into American territory, which the Mexicans denied. We're not 100% sure really what happened, but it was used as what is called a casus belli, a cause for war. If you want to have a war, you have to have an incident that can start it. And maybe the incident would start a war on a normal day, or maybe it's just an excuse because you want a war already. So war began between the United States and Mexico in 1846. Now, as this is happening, by the way, there's a lot of discussion going on in the United States. There's a lot of tension between really North and South, because a lot like the War of 1812, this war is extremely popular in the South because it promises to add more territory, and extremely unpopular in the North because Northerners believe it is a fabricated excuse for war and really just an excuse to seize territory from Mexico to add to the U.S. to be slave territory and strengthen the Southern contingency, or the Southern contingent in Congress. Now, President Polk had claimed, like I said, quote, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory and shed American blood upon American soil. Congressman Joshua Gidding of Ohio said, quote, in the murder of Mexicans upon their own soil, or in robbing them of their country, I can take no part, either now or hereafter. The guilt of these crimes must rest on others. I will not participate in them. And a congressman from Illinois, a little-known congressman, a Whig, named Abraham Lincoln, on the floor of the House, in a speech, said, in reference to Polk's claim that Mexicans had shed American blood on American soil, show me the spot, implying that he didn't believe that. He wanted evidence, and that evidence could not be produced. So the war was on. Meanwhile, over in California, which, like I said, was a province of Mexico, there were some Anglos, some white Americans who had moved out to the Mexican territory of California. And when the war started, General John C. Fremont, known as the Pathfinder, he'd been most famous for being an explorer, he heads out with a contingent of the U.S. Army to California to take California. But before he got there, California was already taken by the Anglos, by the white Americans living there, who rose up and overthrew the headquarters of the Mexican government in California. And there weren't very many Anglos or Mexicans in California, to be honest, at this time. And California declared itself an independent republic. And this was their national flag, which looks a lot like their present state flag with the bear. That's why you've got the college team called the Bruins out there. A Bruin is a kind of bear. So they became an independent republic for 26 days. Just like with Texas, the plan was to turn California over to the U.S. So when Fremont got there, 26 days later, those Anglo rebels turned the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, over to him, and turned California over to the United States. Now, in charge of the Mexican government and the Mexican army was Santa Anna. He's I would say he was still there. Santa Anna's kind of like, he comes into power, and then he's kicked out, and then he gets back into power, then he gets kicked out, then he gets back, off and on for decades. So he had been out of power, and now he'd come back into power. In one battle, because he led the troops personally, he had actually had his leg blown off. And so he gave his leg the most magnificent state burial in Mexican history up to that time. Paraded it. He had it on a velvet pillow in a little casket, a little foot-sized casket, and it was paraded through the streets of Mexico City and enshrined. And when the U.S.-Mexican War took place and American troops occupied Mexico City, they captured Santa Anna's leg. They captured it and didn't give it back. And Mexico still wants it back, but the United States still has it. So there's a little interesting tidbit. I guess you could say Santa Anna's descendants, or Mexico in general, trying to press a legal claim, but they don't have a leg to stand on. Anyway, the U.S. Army invades Mexico with two principal leaders. General Zachary Taylor, who had already gained fame in the Seminole War, the Second Seminole War, known as Old Rough and Ready. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. He looks really rough. I'm not sure if he looks ready. And General Winfield Scott, known as Old Fuss and Feathers, known for being very fastidious. He had been a hero of the War of 1812. So this is now 1846 to 48. That's how long this war lasted. So he's been around for a while. He's still going to be around at the beginning of the Civil War, by the way. Now, an interesting story about some of the U.S. troops. A large number of Irish immigrants who had been drafted into the U.S. Army. Maybe they hadn't been drafted. But anyway, they wound up in the U.S. Army and were very, very reluctant to fight against Mexicans because Mexicans were Catholic, as were they. So a large number of them deserted the U.S. Army and went over to fight on the side of Mexico because, the Irish were treated horribly in the United States with great prejudice. So they actually felt more welcome with the Mexicans. They were known as St. Patrick's Battalion, or the San Patricios, which is Spanish for St. Patrick. This is a scene from a movie about them, 1999. That's pretty good. The last big battle that they were in, the Mexicans lost, and they lost, and the ones that weren't killed in the battle were captured. And, some of them had resigned from the U.S. Army before they went and joined the Mexican Army. But some of them had not bothered to resign first. So technically they were still in the U.S. Army, so they were deserters. They were hanged, 48 of them, in a mass execution. The others, who had resigned first were given 50 lashes with the whip. And if you're not aware of it, 50 lashes is a whole lot. Sometimes it can be fatal. Well, the U.S. won this war and took away, of course, the whole thing about Texas deciding where the border was becomes irrelevant because they just take all of it, as well as all that area in white, including California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona, except for that brown strip at the bottom that the U.S. bought a few years later, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Well, the goals of the Southerners had been achieved, because you look at this and you look at that line. The line is equal, the 1820 Compromise, equal with the northern border of Tennessee. So Colorado and Utah are above the line. Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona are below the line. Part of Nevada is below the line. Nevada didn't become a state for a long while after that. And California is kind of divided in half, which is going to cause problems. But all this is going to cause problems. Remember, Whigs were opposed to this war. Northerners were generally opposed to this war, just as the Whigs were opposed to the very idea of manifest destiny because it seemed un-American. So now we're going to come back once again to Ralph Waldo Emerson. And this is what he had to say at the conclusion of the U.S.-Mexican War, when this territory was taken from Mexico. He said, quote, and they're talking about absorbing part of Mexico, "It will be as the man who swallows arsenic. Mexico will poison us." Well, he was talking about morally, but there's another issue at hand here. The issue is all this territory that's gained. There's going to be controversy. I kind of gave a hint. California is going to be a problem. California almost immediately, has enough people to petition for statehood because gold gets discovered there, and it just gets, invaded by people. But they want to come in as one single state, yet part of their state is above that line and part is below it. This is going to lead to really the undoing of the Compromise of 1820 and a new compromise, the Compromise of 1850, which is brokered, just like the first one was, by Henry Clay. But that's a different story.